lovely people. This week I'm doing another book chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I have been reading fairly recently in the last few months or so.
Sophie vlogs.
I have 5 books to talk about this week, so I'm just going to dive into it, starting with The Feed by Nick Clark Windo. I got this, I went to like a blogger event with my friend Leah from Leah's Dudish, got a bunch of books, and this is one of them. So, this takes place in a world where there is this thing called The Feed, and The Feed is like, everyone has little things in their head, which means they can access the feed, and everyone sort of exists in this, like, virtual sphere. Sorry, my washing machine is on. And then the very question of this, what will you do without it? One day the feed goes down, and then we skip forward a number of years, and we're seeing them, the main characters dealing with this world, and sort of like dealing with this like collapse of society, because it's not just that the feed has gone down, it's that also sometimes people go to sleep and then they'll wake up and someone else is in their body and has taken them over. So, this was interesting. There were some cool ideas in here, especially like this taking over people's body thing. It takes a while for you to really understand what's going on with that. I felt, I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I had some niggles about it. For example, the latter half of this was much more interesting than the first half. The first half just took a long time, in my opinion, to really get going, and then we sort of like got into the meat of it, and that was actually genuinely interesting. I felt like some of the characterization in this was a bit flat. Our main character Tom, we get a lot of stuff from his perspective, and he was kind of fleshed out a bit, but his wife Kate felt very one-dimensional. I didn't really have a lot, I couldn't really tell you much about her personality, very much. But Tom and Kate's daughter goes missing, and they have to try and search to find her, and by doing that they uncover a lot of stuff that explains what's happened to this world. If anything, I could have done with a little bit more. I think essentially I just wanted more than what this gave me. I think there are some interesting seeds, and as a first novel it's not bad. I just think you could have really gone so much further than where you went with this. After that we have The Awakening and Selected Stories by Kate Chopin. And The Awakening I had a lot of feelings about. So The Awakening follows Edna. I'm just going to read you a little bit of the back. When it was first published in 1899, charges of sordidness and immorality consigned this classic into initial obscurity and irreparably damaged its author's literary and social reputation. And I was like, I'm interested. I want to know more. Essentially, Edna has an awakening. And it's sort of, the reason this is viewed as like a feminist classic is because Edna's awakening is sort of just recognizing that she as a woman is also like a human with like her own wants and desires and stuff like this. So in this time when women are supposed to be like wives and mothers, and they're not really supposed to have much of like an internal life going on, Edna goes about claiming that for herself. And it's partly sparked by these feelings she has for this other man, partly he goes away though, so a lot of this narrative is just us following Edna in the absence of this man who has awakened her. And then as she goes about, like, she does a lot of like walking around Paris, which I found very interesting, having read Flamousse by Lauren Elkin, which is all exploring women walking and exploring towns and stuff like that. Like, that was an interesting little play, which reminded me a lot that this is definitely a book focused on a woman of a certain class. Like, a working class woman could have the same awakening when they realise that they are more than a wife and a mother and they are an individual with their own desires, but they would also have to, like, work and provide and live, and therefore they couldn't do this type of exploration that's happening in this book. But like, I feel like that's just something that comes with texts like this. You just have to acknowledge that. I find it very interesting that it was so shocking at the time, because these ideas of I'm not like, yay, go out, have all the affairs, but like affairs nowadays are not such a shocking thing to us, but the sheer implications that she could have an affair with someone who is not her husband, like, was so intensely shocking at the time. I find that, like, it's just weird being reminded of that sometimes. But then also, this attitude she has with her children, like, I understand that, like, women of a certain class had more of a separation with their children. A lot of childcare would be dealt with like servants and stuff. But also this recognition that she says that she loves her children and she would die for her children, but she will not give up herself for her children. And I found it interesting reading some reviews on Goodreads, because there are a couple of reviewers on Goodreads who were absolutely, in this day, absolutely shocked that a woman would say this. And by all means, I'm firmly in the camp of, like, if you're going to choose to have children, look after your children, like, be a responsible parent, yes. But also, in a time when that is not a choice, you would just have children because, like, the idea of having a conversation with your husband where you discuss if you want children is, like, so out there, like, it would never happen. That acknowledgement that maybe being a mother is not what is entirely fulfilling to her and maybe she wants to do some other things, I can see how that was really radical at the time. I'm firmly here for, like, women, if being a mother entirely fulfills you, that's wonderful. If being a mother is wonderful but there are other things you also want to do, that's also wonderful. It's just interesting to look back on a time when that wasn't even a discussion you could have. So, like, interesting, had some thoughts. The rest of the collection, as is the way with short story collections, some of them I liked, some of them I liked less. I liked the Lilacs quite a lot, because a lot of these take place within, like, Creole society and stuff like that. And the Lilacs was different because it didn't, and I think it made me pay more attention to it in some ways, because it was like, oh, why are you writing about this now? Why have you gone outside of this realm that you normally explore? What is it about this narrative? And it made me, like, think about it a bit more. But interesting. I think I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, if I remember correctly. Probably would have given The Awakening 4, because it just made me think about a lot of stuff. After that, I read The Tombs of Atuan, which is the second book in Ursula K Le Guin's Earth-Sea Cycle thing, quartet. Sorry. Since I made that video where I was like, here are all the series that I'm halfway through, I should really finish them, I'm really trying to finish them, so I'm trying to read more of the Earth-Sea Quartet and, like, finish it within living memory so I remember everything that's happening. The second book was quite short. I think the final 2 books are a bit longer based on where I am on this. I love Ursula K Le Guin. I just think she's brilliant, and I'm really enjoying Earthsea, because I feel like at the heart of Earthsea there's really this idea of, like, balance. And it happened a lot in the first one with this sort of, like, the shadow. I won't talk about it in detail because this is the second book and I don't want to spoil anything. This has a different setting from the first book, and it takes you a small while to understand how it's going to connect back into the story of the first book. We're following a young priestess, as she is, she's supposed to be high priestess of this place, as she's, like, learning what her duties are and growing as a human being and all stuff like this, and then she meets this, part of what she looks after is the terms of Atuan, and only she is supposed to go in them, and then one day someone else is in the tombs, and she's like, okay, what's going on here? Yes, so there's this idea of balance, this, I've also recently read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has, like, this idea where, like, good versus evil, good vanquishes evil, that's sort of, like, the narrative, and I really enjoyed Lord of the Rings, but we're very much, like, light triumphing over dark, whereas Earthsea very much feels to me like finding that balance in between the two, so, like, dark is here, light is here, and you are here, and you maintain, like, this balance both within yourself and also within this world and stuff like that. So, like, I'm really enjoying Earthsea Quartet. I will definitely be reading the third one really soon, so it's going to pop up in a book chat sometime soon. Yes, enjoy, would recommend. I'm going to end on 2 non-fiction books. The first one is Fashioning the Feminine, Representation and Women's Fashion from the Fin de Siecle to the Present by Cheryl Buckley and Hilary Fawcett. I'm interested in fashion. I do not consider myself overly fashionable, but I like reading, like, fashion history, because fashion history is so often tied with, like, social history and that sort of thing. This was a mixed bag. The first 2 chapters I thought were best. So the Fin de Siecle is, like, Edwardian, sort of like 1880, 1890. That was really interesting. We're all looking at how fashion ties in with ideas of femininity, and I found it very interesting to explore this concept that, like, because essentially Edward had a lot of affairs. He had a lot of affairs with, like, women who were in their, like, 40s. So, like, this idea we have where, like, fashion is tied to, like nowadays fashion is tied to, like, youth and, like, trying to sustain youth. In the Fin de Siecle, it was like this matronly idea of womanhood was what was being pushed. So, like, young girls, you're like, whatever. It's like your 40-year-old woman that you're like, yes, peak fashion, yay. And that was so interesting to read about. It was like just, I never really thought about it before, but yeah, these influential women were the women who were involved with Edward, therefore they were like women, not girls. Chapter 3 was fashion, women's magazines, and the female body during the Great War, so that's World War One, which again was really interesting because like when you talk fashion history, like I feel very familiar with the basic concepts of World War Two, so like 1940s fashion, and 1950s fashion as a reaction against that, and all this, like that's an area I feel very comfortable with. World War One fashion is not something I've really read a lot about before, so that was very interesting, and very interesting to parallel, like, both World War One and World War Two, you're going, like, fashion as more practical, fashion as more, like, rationing fabric, stuff like this, and yet the silhouettes are so different, so that was also really interesting. Chapter 4 was, looking at fashion between World War One and World War Two, so up to 1939. That was again very interesting, especially looking at like the role of like cinema on fashion, that sort of thing. That was interesting. Where I then got a bit fed up was chapter 5 is Young Women, Fashion and Sexuality. This was published 1999. So bearing in mind that up to this point all of our chapters have very much been like going through like portions of around 20 years at a time, if like that varies, but whatever. From like 1880 to 1939 we have very comprehensively studied this, and then we just skip a bunch of time, and like that final chapter briefly talks about the 70s and 80s touchingly, but it's largely focused on the 90s. It's very specifically largely actually focused on northern women, specifically Newcastle, specifically like clubbing, and like good lord, I'm glad I was a child in the 90s, not an adult, because it gave me real flashbacks to like what fashion was at that time, and I don't always love what it was, but I just got frustrated that the entire rest of the book just didn't really feel like it fit. I understand we're still looking at ideas of femininity, but what happened to all this time in between? Why? It felt like a book, and then like a random essay had been tacked onto it, kind of. And it was interesting to read about, but at the same time, like, I just felt like we'd had this entire book, and then it just seemed very incongruous at the end. So that was like a disappointing ending. But yeah, that's how I felt about that. A book that I really liked is A Pirate of Exquisite Mind, The Life of William Dampier, Explorer, Naturalist and Buccaneer by Diana and Michael Preston. This was super duper interesting. William Dampier, in the 17th century, he's from Somerset. He had perfectly, like, not an overly fancy upbringing or circumstances or anything. He became a buccaneer. So before the golden age of piracy, when piracy was really flourishing, like 1700 to 1725, you had various sorts of like types of pirate, if you will, that were not quite full-on pirates as we think of them. So like privateers were people who had been granted permission, essentially, by their king to then go off and like steal from the ships of your enemies. So like English privateers would be able to seize Spanish ships because England and Spain were not friends at the time, that sort of thing. Buccaneers are like kind of like that, but like less official, so they're not like full-on pirates, but they will also try and steal your ship. William Dampier is interesting because as well as being like a buccaneer, so like spent a lot of time while doing all this stuff to do with like logging and stuff, like buccaneering around the place, but he was also like an intensely bright scientific mind. So he spent all this time going around buccaneering, but while he's doing it, in all the different countries he's going to, he's making meticulous notes about observing nature, observing animals, like, for example, just to give you like a taste of like this type of scientific mind, Charles Darwin drew upon his writings while formulating his Origin of the Species, because William Dampier went to Galapagos before Charles Darwin did. He was one of the first people, like, he refers to this turtle as a bastard turtle, as his way of comparing, like, oh, this turtle I saw in this place looks like this, and this one's like a bastard turtle, because it means that it's still a turtle, but it's got all these differences that have adapted because of where it's at. So it's this first time that you're really coming up with this concept of, like, subspecies. He also, like, he was just really cool, guys. He went to Australia before Captain Cook went to Australia. He did a lot of introducing so many words to the English language that had previously not been known, like chopsticks and barbecue and all these words. Like, he just introduced them. What I found interesting is the way that Dampier, like, didn't inherently think that he was better. You have this colonization was not a great time, guys. There are a lot of people who went over to a lot of places and were like, we're better than you. We're gonna take all your things and blah, blah, blah. William Dampier, one thing I liked about him is that a lot of the time his view was like, I'm not coming here to teach you how to do it all my way. I want to learn what you do, why you do it that way, that sort of thing, which was interesting. He wanted to learn the languages a lot of places he went to. He observed a lot of, like, why they did certain things and stuff. That was really interesting. This book did not shy away from showing you the negatives about Dampier. Like, he's not being painted as a saint here. And, like, he had a lot of troubles with a lot of people, not always getting on well with people, and didn't necessarily choose the best friends, and all this sort of stuff. But what I just found fascinating is, for this figure who had such an influence, like, he made maps of tides and water currents and stuff, and also, like, winds and stuff like this, that are so accurate that you can still, over 300 years later, like, navigate by them and you'll be fine. And that's just wild to me. So, like, he's this guy who discovered all these things, but then because he's sort of, like, his buccaneering past was, like, frowned upon and all stuff like this, he's sort of faded into obscurity by now. Like, not a lot of people seem to know who he is. But I just think he's a really cool person. I don't think he's a flawless person, but it was very interesting. I think I'm finding this period of time, like the Age of Discovery, specifically, like, to do with, like, botany and, like, understanding, like, the evolution of things. I'm just finding that really interesting at the moment. I don't know. Suffice to say, this has been a ramble. This was a good book. William Dampier was an interesting figure. I'm surprised we don't remember him more. Also, very accessibly written, very easy to consume and take everything in. Would recommend. Yes. Those are all the books I wanted to talk about this week. I feel like I went really rambly at the end there. Have you read any of these? Do you have opinions on them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Chat to me about books. That's the general gist of this video series. I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will see you next week for something different.